Please give us £1, or we'll have to pull the trigger.
Cloud your day. Super Troopers.
Then re-record, not fade away. Re-record, not fade away. Re-record, not fade away.
Las Vegas. Glittering cathedral, grown from the dust of Nevada. Sin City. More than anywhere, this eternal casino represents the cultural logic of the postmodern epoch. Its neon spires and sultry motels, narcotic parties and violent undertows. They need no structure. Image spills into image, reference into reference, and humanity into quotation. There is no feeling here, only the dull ache of overworn symbols and a steady stream of cash. Parody without punchline. To grasp this logic as a real historical phenomenon, we must first understand that its roots cannot be reduced to the work of a single theorist, or even to a body of work written by a group of postmodern theorists. Though such a body of theory exists, most famously emerging in France with writers like Jacques Derrida, Jean-François Lyotard, or Jean Baudrillard, and was a crucial component of postmodern culture's development, its roots as a cultural logic rest in a complex mesh of cultural, political, and economic processes. A simple history of any one of these strands is but a component of an explanation. Even in a simplified expression of such an explanation, it is therefore necessary to begin by considering that which came before the postmodern, that is, modernism.
After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace, and reverberation of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying with a little patience.
Modernism, like postmodernism, refers to both an intellectual and artistic outlook or tradition of considerable variety and a specific mode of bourgeois cultural dominance. However, what unity exists within what we might now consider as theories of the modern is much more plain to see from our present historical vantage point. Emerging in the mid to late 19th century in Europe, the US and Japan, what unites the intellectual impulse of the modernist movement is that it exists as a reaction to the immense technological and social change that unfolded over this period. In general, but not universally, modernism embraces these changes to an extent, rejecting the old resolutely in the same breath. With that said, it also holds considerable unease at the sundering of tradition which it embraces. Each modernist trend, or even intellectual, proposing their own problems and solutions. This intellectual construction, that is, the notion that society may now be objectively cured from whatever ill it is diagnosed by the author's prescription, produced modernism's intellectual culture of manifestos, and forms what postmodern theory terms a meta-narrative. It is necessary to linger on modernism's relationship to the economic and material upheaval produced by the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the industrial boom which followed it across the world. The gravity of this process is hard to imagine. Between the 18th and 19th centuries, capitalism established itself as a global force, uprooting huge swathes of the population. For example, between 1800 and 1850, the population size of London, Birmingham, Glasgow, and Liverpool more than doubled. A total of 50% of England's population lived in cities by the middle of the 19th century. The same process was unfolding in Europe, and in the US, capital claimed the land as fertile in the wake of its colonial gangsters. The traditions of the past were not only dying, they were already dead, buried in the rubble of rural life, or stuffed into Buckingham Palace. Whilst, of course, many people clung to past traditions, the new reality did not allow them dominance any longer. The need for a new culture in such circumstances is palpable. Yet this alone does not capture precisely the economic circumstance of modernism in its development. The latter half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, that is, the period through which modernism attains dominance as an intellectual and cultural outlook, bear witness to the birth of imperialism, that is, monopoly capitalism dominated by finance capital. This entailed a considerable change in the relationship between the capitalist countries and their colonies in the oppressed world. Whilst capitalism has always been reliant on colonial exploitation for raw materials, this reliance deepened with the export of usury capital, that is, extortionate money lending, becoming a permanent feature of this exploitation. Capital spread to dominate and connect the world. It did so in a desperate, violent flight, circling the globe to find profits that could not be found in its national boundaries. This sickness, of course, became terminal, producing the World Wars.
Let's go, men! Come on! Go on, boys! Come on! Get up here! All of you now! Shoot after! Shoot out!
It is crucial that we neither under nor overstate the significance of this economic and political process to modernism's development. Though it cannot be divorced from these developments, modernism is not merely a reflection of them. Rather, it was developed in the context of these processes. They formed the material and political reality of those associated with the movement, and thus the context, raw materials, and even object of criticism for their intellectual output. As such, modernism formed an active component of this reality. It was not only shaped by these developments, but also shaped them within given material limits. A further fundamental material change underpinning the development of modernism can be seen in the emergence of film. Following the emergence of commercial public film screenings in 1895 in Paris, the film industry began to blossom throughout the imperialist nations. Not only does film come to form itself as a central medium in the artistic output of modernism at its heights, for example, the German Expressionist movement beginning in the 1910s, but its emergence led to the formation of a qualitatively new relationship between the state and the arts. This is particularly evident in the United States, with D.W. Griffith's 1915 fascist epic, Birth of a Nation, marking the beginning of a long and consistent relationship of cooperation between the US state and Hollywood. The film, which depicts the Ku Klux Klan as heroes, received extras and military equipment from the US Army for its battle sequences. Over the next few decades, this relationship continued to deepen and spread, with the CIA, FBI, and numerous other agencies finding their way into Hollywood, offering assistance for script edits. Whereas prior to film's emergence, state intervention in the arts had existed in the form of censorship and patronage, this type of intervention saw the state take hold of creative control in a very direct way. The various material, economic, and ideological strands discussed thus far provide an abstract of modernism's impetus and development. What remains here is to quantify the assertion that it represented a specifically bourgeois form of cultural dominance or ideological outlook. To grasp this, we must understand that the cultural logic of modernism was by no means totalized in its domination. This can be illustrated by two factors. Firstly, the various different artistic and ideological trends within the broader modernist movement generally upheld a rigid separation between high and popular culture. This is telling of both the political character of the foremost concern held by many of the modernists, put bluntly, what the ideological character of the imperialist bourgeoisie ought to be, and of why modernist cultural output failed to find much of an audience within the working classes outside of film. This is not to say that there were no modernists who concerned themselves with working class politics. There certainly were, with the Russian futurist movement serving as a clear example. Rather, it is to say that modernism was dominated by bourgeois intellectuals, and that this character was retained not only by the mechanisms of cultural power identified by Marx and Gramsci, but also in several of its most broadly shared ideological suppositions. In essence, therefore, modernism represents the generally dominant cultural and in some senses political suppositions of the period of imperialist capitalism's emergence. That this ideological dominance consists of variance, even contest, between multiple different trends is illustrative of a feature of class rule, particularly in the cultural sphere. Hegemony does not equate to a single, unified and omnipresent ideology, but to a certain set of fundamental ideological assumptions which assume a component of a variety of contrasting, even bitterly divided, aesthetic, philosophical and political positions. Without an understanding of the economic processes of class power and exploitation, which represent the real and concrete systems of domination of all hitherto existing societies, even the most bitter outcries of agony and protest necessarily fall on the deaf ears of such broadly held assumptions. The World Wars brought an abrupt and startling end to the modernist epoch. As the world fell into the ravenous flames of the imperialist scramble for dominance over the world economy, the meta-narratives of progressive, rational, and definitive improvement wrought from machines, common within modernism, could not be maintained. In the face of their crimes, now home to roost, the imperialist world could not manage such optimism. It is little wonder that the seeds of postmodernism were sown in this devastation. The first general theorisation of the term as an historical epoch emerging in 1939, in the 5th volume of Arnold J. Toynbee's A Study of History. As Toynbee writes, our own postmodern age has been inaugurated by the General War of 1914 to 1918. We must add, and consecrated by the War of 1939 to 1945. Despite the rejection of modernism brought about by the wars, the general intellectual and cultural premises of what we now consider postmodernity did not come to properly dominate until the 1970s and 80s. The first, and perhaps foremost, reason for this is eminently political: the victories of the international working class. Though the revolutionary wave that followed the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 was stemmed in Europe, its influence continued to build throughout the continent with the consolidation of socialism in Russia. The complication for modernism's demise is immediately obvious in view of the cultural forms which sprang up in the young socialist nation. Russian futurism, the proletkult, a mass arts movement organised with workers, socialist realism. These movements and more all found their home in the revolution. Their intellectual culture of manifestos resembled that of a type of modernism and gave birth to some incredible achievements. For example, the emergence of cinematic montage. As each trend intended to prove itself as the only socialist art, it also fertilised the political and intellectual environment which led to the adoption of socialist realism as the official art form of the revolution. The broader cultural impact of the Bolshevik Revolution in the imperialist nations is inseparable from both the working class's cultural experience of the wars and the economic circumstances which followed them. This is extremely clear when considering the 1930s. The First World War gave birth to an extensive culture of letter writing among the working class, stranded at the front with precious little else. The idle time spent in trenches or hospitalised produced war poetry. An active intellectual culture formed among sections of the working class where it otherwise would not. Politically, the war also left a mark on the workers, and for a very simple reason. The Bolshevik Revolution ended the war. When these factors combined with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, the conditions were ripe for a political culture. Whilst this cultural tide was turned by the consolidation of fascism in Italy, Germany and Japan, and the resumption of hostilities in 1939, the implications of this influence in the 30s are clear when one considers the Soviet advance into Berlin in 1945. Still operating in the culturally modernist style of socialist realism and propaganda art, Soviet cultural influence was more than simply local.
It was global. The significance of this for the development of postmodernism and postmodernity is enormous. Having established and consolidated its dominance as the hegemon of the imperialist world through the world wars, the US turned its eye to cultural struggle against communism in their immediate aftermath. In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee introduced its first Hollywood blacklist of around 300 artists. This expanded openly until 1956. The aim was to root out communists and other subversives, with notable names like Charlie Chaplin.
Therefore, propaganda is vastly more important in democratic societies.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it.
One of the most serious challenges our countries face is the specter of socialism. It's the wrecker of nations and destroyer of societies.
Alex, did you try to reset me? Alex. Alongside this process of purging, the role of the state deepened in every arena of the entertainment industry. Whilst each branch of the US state, and even their internal divisions, adopt unique strategies toward the various practices of the cultural sphere, it is worth observing the general practices of its largest players. The Pentagon focused upon the experience of the world wars, aiding around 200 war films a decade in the 50s and 60s, in exchange for script edits and deification. The FBI sanitized its image through the 40s, 50s and 60s, and demonized oppressed groups in projects its support was granted to. Despite the depth and scale of these interventions, the CIA's efforts are perhaps the most important. Consumed by what is often termed its cultural Cold War against communism, the CIA worked to cultivate cultural elements useful to this cause, both domestically and internationally. For example, through a clandestine relationship with the head of domestic and foreign censorship at Paramount Studios in the 50s, the agency planted what it termed well-dressed Negroes in their films, with the aim of preventing the Soviet Union from highlighting the US's appalling racism. A famous example of its work internationally comes in the form of the agency's 1954 adaptation of Orwell's Animal Farm. The extent to which the role of the state in the arts conditions postmodernity is considerable. Whilst the CIA did not create postmodernism, it strongly encouraged and coerced its fruition. Alongside its influence in film, it had ample ground to operate among the traditional arts. In literature, it cultivated an intellectual culture which pursued the fancy stuff of rarefied and abstract symbolism, with the founding of the Iowa Writers' Workshop in the 1930s. This had a profound effect on creative writing programs across the US. More broadly, it established the Congress for Cultural Freedom in 1950. This was used to organise a cultural fight against communism internationally, with offices in 35 countries and countless journals at its height. Through it, the CIA took a special interest in abstract expressionism, as it believed it made socialist realism look even more rigid and confined than it was, and organised a considerable number of exhibitions. Beyond this enormous effort, the CIA and the broader infrastructure of the US state was intimately involved in shaping the artistic and political culture of television, which rapidly gained dominance as a cultural medium in the 50s, with 90% of US households owning a television set by 1960, compared to 9% in 1950. Whilst it may not have planted the seeds, the US state certainly fertilised the soil. Yet this cultural assault alone was not enough to see postmodernism attain dominance as an intellectual and cultural outlook. What was required for this process to take place is a combination of two factors: the emergence of an intellectual movement of quote-unquote left-wing postmodernist theorists, and the defeat of working class movements in the imperialist nations. Both of these factors began to emerge through the 1960s, most evidently in France. The major names of postmodern theory, for example Foucault, Lyotard, Derrida and Baudrillard, largely begin their writing over this period. In May 1968, a mass movement of workers and students had seriously challenged the imperialist French state, even forcing the president, Charles de Gaulle, to flee Paris. Its defeat, largely owing to the failures of the French Communist Party, was catastrophic. It is in context of this defeat that what the CIA has described as the defection of the left-wing intellectuals was consolidated. For example, through the early 70s, Lyotard's writing focuses upon the rejection of Freudianism and Marxism as meta-narratives, viewing both as equally based upon theology and as imposing upon reality, not analysing it. Even those who had held sympathies toward communism, Foucault and Baudrillard for example, roundly reject Marxism following the defeats of '68.
What happens with the postmodernists is they say, oh, there's an infinite number of interpretations. And then the human part of them goes, okay, well, what am I supposed to do next then, since there's an infinite number of choices? And the postmodernist says, well, my theory can't account for that. And then they say, well, back to Marxism. And so that's why I think there's this unholy alliance between the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists.
The rise of postmodernism to dominance through the 70s and 80s is rooted in this process of counter-revolution. To fully understand this, we must grasp the economic process unfolding beneath it. The glut of investment opportunities created by the destruction of the world wars produced the post-war boom. In 1974, this boom came to an end, with negative GDP growth recorded in Britain, Japan, and the US. Accordingly, the bourgeoisie set about dismantling the state to open new areas for investment and began a process of deindustrialization in the imperialist nations to redirect capital investment to the oppressed world where wages and land prices were lower. The significance of this process for ideology is hard to understate. As neoliberalism swept away whatever organised working class resistance remained in the imperialist nations, the influence of Marxism and socialist cultural output was also swept away. More than this, the destruction of industry created an illusion fundamental to postmodern thought: the end of societies of production and their transformation into societies of consumption. This is not to say that postmodern theory adopts the stance that production has literally ceased. Rather, it treats production as secondary to consumption. An example of this position can be seen in Baudrillard's work, beginning with his 1968 book, The System of Objects. His position here is based upon a critique of Marx. In the first volume of Capital, Marx argues that there are two forms of value embodied in the commodity: use value, what a commodity does, and exchange value, how much it may be traded for. This latter form is determined by a third form, simply termed value, which is created by human labour power. Baudrillard argues that a fourth form of value, termed sign value, is now key in determining the value of a commodity. This form, he goes on, is determined by how desirable a commodity is in relation to other commodities. That is, where it fits in a hierarchy of objects. It is in this way that he shifts the critique of capital, a concrete relation between people, to the critique of consumption and its supposed hierarchies. That is, a necessarily subjective relationship between things. Although initially, Baudrillard does not assign a greater role to sign value than to value production, by the end of the 1970s, his position shifts to suggest that sign value is the primary determinant of value. This, he argues, is the postmodern condition. In context of neoliberalism and deindustrialization, it is clear that this is but an appearance created by the conditions in the imperialist nations. Its political consequences are equally clear. To erase production, one must also erase imperialist exploitation.
Last year, when workers were raising wages for $71 minimum wage per month for 208-hour work, there was a lot of movement across the all industrial belt where the garment factory is located. But what happened? The factory owners and the government, they said it is an unrest. They have arrested us. We have been interrogated 18 hours in a row. My colleague Babul, he has been tortured. He has been beaten badly in the police custody. During that time, Walmart's subcontractor factory management was present there when he was beaten.
Looks like we got ourselves a winner, Davey. Show us what's behind the curtain.
The inordinate growth of TV ownership in the imperialist nations over the 50s and 60s laid the groundwork for the emergence of the dominant artistic medium of postmodernity, video. This term refers to both an aesthetic visual form and a material change in the distribution and consumption of filmic art. In terms of aesthetics, television and subsequently video operate as an uninterrupted flow of the screen, the movement of the television show simply merging with that of advertisements. The consumption of this flow is entirely voluntary. Put simply, the television goes on whether we watch it or not. We tune in and out, quite unlike the fixed attention required by a film. As such, video replaces film's use of metaphor and symbolism with simple signifiers, images which refer to other images, thus appearing to contain their meaning. The release and popularisation of VHS tapes from 1976 onward made this flow properly malleable, deepening this process. A clear example can be found in the instance of horror film, which until the advent of the 1980s had preserved itself as a political, even anti-capitalist, form of cinema. With the avalanche of homemade video nasties and Hollywood's turn to the slasher film spurred by the need to compete with this avalanche, political horror all but disappears, drowned in the multitude of videos that evoke its style but reject its meaning. As such, the modernist distinction between high and low culture collapses, the two forms merging, and art's nature as a relationship is obscured as its consumption comes to appear ever more subjective. In this sense, video serves to illustrate the primary aesthetic form of postmodern art in general. This is known as pastiche. To put this simply, where modernism's rallying call in the arts was make it new, the attitude of postmodernity in the arts is that nothing can be new. Pastiche is the realisation of this attitude, the combination of old styles and forms, as if they were in a parody, but without humour or meaning. This style of aesthetic construction appears across all mediums under postmodern hegemony. It is crucial to highlight that pastiche represents a broader feature of postmodernity, termed simulacrum. This term with its modern use originating in the works of Deleuze and Baudrillard, describes a representation with no resemblance to reality whatsoever. As society has become increasingly reliant on representations of reality to define reality itself, these models have increasingly lost touch with the real. Simulacrum thus come to inform the lived reality of humanity more than reality itself. In this way, aesthetic representations and the specific field of art have become ever more dominant in the superstructure of bourgeois society.
Some questions of our crowd here. Sir, tell me, do you believe in ghosts?
No, but I know who to call if there are.
Is that right? Yeah, and who would that be?
Ghostbusters.
Oh, very funny, okay.
The most fundamental ideological characteristic of postmodernity is put succinctly by Frederick Jameson. The postmodern is an attempt to think historically, in an age that has forgotten how. Whilst Jameson is by no means innocent of this, also arguing that postmodernism represents the completion of the modernization process, where nature is gone for good. His observation is fundamental. Owing in part to the proliferation of simulacrum, and in part to postmodern theory's emphasis upon consumption, the ideological suppositions of postmodernity renders real historical investigation impossible. Instead, it postulates historicisms, mere images of events in which society changed. This tendency, always dormant within the various tendencies of the postmodern movement, has deepened considerably since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, with Francis Fukuyama's declaration of the end of history serving as its clearest expression, whilst Derrida, for example, rejected this claim.
He and the rest of postmodernism theorists do not escape it. The rejection of the various modernist theories of historical development, often serving
as a rejection of historical change outright. To the postmodernist, all that remains are images. Whilst what has been discussed here is by no means comprehensive, it is enough to state plainly what postmodernism represents as an historical phenomenon. Coerced by the state in its cultural war on communism, fertilised by postmodern theory and its rejection of Marxism, and grown from the ashes of working class defeat. Postmodernism is the ideological and cultural outlook of the imperialist counter-revolution. Its fundamental features are staunch anti-communism.
I don't affiliate myself with any extremist group.
Lost in the storm.
Get deeper! Get deeper!
A rejection of the existence of imperialism, the analysis of consumerism serving as a substitute for the analysis of capitalism, an embrace of subjectivism and aestheticism, and finally, a malleable culture of perpetual flow, dominated by the medium of video. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, its dominance has not ceased. Rather, postmodern consciousness has simply become more and more deluded, rejecting even history and nature. Today, however, this dominance is coming to an end.